They say some betrayals whisper before they scream. Mine screamed loud and clear, into a microphone on a crystal-lit night. The Charleston waterfront hall shimmered beneath golden chandeliers and soft river breeze. Everyone was dressed in elegance, sipping champagne under strings of fairy lights, their eyes turned toward the evening's honorees. My daughter Lila, radiant in a deep emerald gown, stood among them, nominated for her work establishing a community initiative for displaced youth. At 22, she was the youngest recipient of the city's Rising Citizen Award. I should have been thinking about how proud I was. But something in the air felt off. I'm Celeste Warren, financial strategist by profession, wife of 25 years to a man who built his reputation on charm, mother to a daughter who believed her parents were unshakable. And on that April evening, under the gaze of Charleston's elite, I felt the pressure of a truth I'd been holding for months. My husband Malcolm had been distant. The late meetings, the business trips that didn't align with his calendar. And most of all Sienna Cole, his assistant, who had started appearing more often than necessary. Young, striking, with that careful veneer of professionalism that rarely held under scrutiny. The first red flag came 3 months prior. I'd noticed unusual movements in our joint investment account, quiet transfers to unfamiliar entities in Belize and the Isle of Man. He didn't know I could trace those trails in my sleep. That night, as the MC raised a glass to celebrate Charleston's rising leaders, Malcolm leaned toward the podium, champagne flute in hand, smiling like he owned the world. His voice rang out confidently, perfectly rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we toast tonight's brilliant youth, I have something deeply personal to share." My heart slowed. The room quieted. Even Lila paused mid-laugh. "I've found someone new," he continued, looking directly at Sienna, who gave a tight, victorious smile. "Sienna and I have decided to start a new life together. We're leaving Charleston. In fact, we fly out tomorrow morning." Gasps swept the hall. Murmurs broke like sudden wind. Lila's smile disappeared. My sister clutched my arm. But I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Because this wasn't news to me. What Malcolm didn't know was that I had known every step of his plan. For months I had tracked each wire, each hotel booking, every late-night call disguised as a client emergency. I had traced shell companies registered in Sienna's name. Had frozen accounts. I had already spoken with my lawyer, Margaret Lynn, and secured every piece of documentation that would dismantle his exit strategy. He thought he was giving the grand finale of his secret opera. But he had no idea I was about to rewrite the entire act. Lila turned to me, confusion in her eyes. Malcolm raised his glass higher, as if waiting for applause. The room was in suspense. It was the perfect stage. And I had brought the closing script. To be continued. The crowd's disbelief echoed through the hall like broken glass. Lila stood frozen, her eyes darting between Malcolm and me, trying to process the wreckage left behind by that one careless announcement. Sienna clung to his arm as though public scandal were a badge of honor. She smirked slightly, convinced that the worst I could do was cry quietly and disappear with grace. But I didn't come to disappear. I rose slowly from my seat. Every step across the wooden floor echoed louder than the whispers spreading like wildfire through the crowd. My heels clicked with intention. Every eye turned toward me. Lila's eyes widened with unspoken questions. Malcolm's smile faltered for the first time. I stopped a few feet from him and took the microphone from its stand. "Before anyone congratulates them," I said clearly, scanning the sea of stunned faces, "I'd like to share a little story of my own." I reached into my clutch and pulled out a thick manila envelope tied with a crimson string. "I've known about your affair for months, Malcolm," I continued, turning slightly to address the audience. "The offshore transfers, the secret accounts, the business trips that led not to boardrooms, but beachfront suites booked under fake names. You thought I'd be too busy organizing charity dinners and managing retirement portfolios to notice. But you forgot who I am." Sienna's confidence cracked like cheap porcelain. Inside this envelope are detailed bank records, correspondence between you two, and notarized statements from hotel concierges and staff who've seen you more often than your own colleagues, I said, offering the envelope with a tight smile. Consider it my donation to tonight's theme, truth. Malcolm reached out, but his hand trembled. His fingers brushed the envelope as if it were a bomb. I let it fall to the floor. It landed with a heavy slap. That sound, so simple, was louder than any mic in that room. Gasps followed. Andrew, Malcolm's younger brother, stepped away from the punch table and shook his head. His wife Emily muttered something that sounded like, "Unbelievable," before turning toward Lila, arms open, ready to shield her. "I was going to wait until Monday to file the court order," I continued, voice steady. "But since you were so eager to make this public, let's just accelerate the timeline." Sienna finally found her voice. "You can't do this," she hissed. "You have no right." "I have every right," I cut in, turning to her. "You were an employee of my husband's company, engaging in a relationship that violates their ethics policy. In fact, you're transferred to that new office in Zurich. It never went through. The board blocked it this morning. Something about a conflict of interest and breach of fiduciary duty." Malcolm's face blanched. "You went to the board?" he asked, barely above a whisper. "No," I said coolly. "They came to me. You weren't as discreet as you thought." He reached for my arm, trying to steer me away from the crowd, but I held my ground. "You thought you could use my daughter's celebration as the backdrop for your cowardly escape," I said louder now. "But you miscalculated, Malcolm. Because while you were planning your exit, I was securing my fortress." The guests stood frozen, some wide-eyed, some horrified. A few looked as though they might clap, but decorum held them still. Lila finally stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Dad, is this true?" Malcolm turned toward her, but for the first time he had no words. I stepped between them gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's all right, Lila," I whispered. "The worst part is already over." But I wasn't finished yet. Because Malcolm hadn't read page 2. The page that held the freeze order. The page that made him officially powerless. And that moment was coming soon. To be continued. Malcolm bent down slowly, fingers grasping the envelope like it might burn him. He opened it with jerky, nervous movements, his breath shallow as the first page came into view. The gold lighting of the hall cast a soft glow across his features, but it did nothing to hide the pallor sweeping into his face. He wasn't reading a love letter. He was reading the blueprint of his downfall. The top page, stamped and dated, bore the unmistakable seal of the Charleston County Courthouse. "Petition for divorce, filed by Celeste Warren." His eyes scanned the words, and I could tell the realization was dawning in waves. First shock, then confusion, then anger. "What is this?" he muttered, voice tight. "You're looking at the beginning of a very detailed legal process," I said calmly. "One that includes asset protection, forensic audits, and sworn testimony from multiple witnesses, including members of your own staff." His hands shook as he flipped to the second page. There it was, the official asset freeze, signed by Judge Holly S. Temple. Effective immediately, every personal and business account in Malcolm's name had been locked. Every card, every investment, every hidden stash in accounts named after shell corporations. His mouth parted, but no sound came out. "I moved first," I said quietly, stepping closer. "You should know better than anyone, Malcolm. Timing is everything." Sienna leaned in, reading over his shoulder. Her jaw tightened. "Babe, what does this mean?" she asked, her tone no longer smug but sharp with fear. "Does this mean the Zurich account is frozen?" I finished for her. "Along with the wire transfer you initiated yesterday morning at 7:42 a.m. to a Swiss bank. That one bounced back to my firm's compliance department before you even parked your car." Malcolm looked like a man who had forgotten how to breathe. From the corner of the room, Margaret Lynn, my attorney, emerged from the crowd. Dressed in tailored navy and holding her phone like a scalpel, she gave me a short nod. "She's here." Malcolm sputtered. She wanted to make sure you received your paperwork in person, I replied, with a trace of satisfaction. Margaret doesn't like to leave loose ends. Sienna looked around, her eyes flicking from the guests to the looming figures of 2 senior executives from Malcolm's company who had arrived minutes earlier. One of them, Mr. Easton, had his arms crossed. He was whispering something into a headset. "You think this will ruin me?" Malcolm said through clenched teeth, voice trembling as he tried to hold what little pride he had left. "You can't destroy everything I've built." I tilted my head, watching the man who once ruled boardrooms now visibly unravel. "I don't have to destroy anything, Malcolm," I said. "You did that on your own." I simply removed the blindfold. Behind me I felt Lila stir. She stepped forward slowly, each step echoing on the hardwood floor like a slow drumbeat. Her voice was soft but steady. "You did this, on the night I was being honored?" she asked, staring directly at her father. "You chose this moment." Malcolm's face crumpled slightly. "Lila, I didn't mean. You meant every part of it," she snapped. "You stood there smiling while Mom planned this whole event. You knew. And you still chose to burn it all down." Gasps rippled through the audience again. This time they weren't for shock. They were for shame. Sienna looked like she wanted to sink into the marble floor. "I was never going to stay quiet," I told Malcolm. "But I wanted you to feel what it's like to lose control. To watch everything slip away, just like you planned for me." He reached for the microphone again, but Mr. Easton stepped in first. "Mr. Warren," he said sharply, "you'll need to step away from the podium. Effective immediately. You've been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Do not contact employees or enter company premises until further notice." The final crack echoed through the hall like the end of a symphony. Malcolm stepped back, speechless, ill, powerless. I took one last glance at the envelope, now crumpled in his fist, and I smiled, because he had always loved being the one with the last word. But tonight that belonged to me. To be continued. Silence. Heavy and unforgiving, it filled the space Malcolm once dominated with his rehearsed charm and polished grin. The charity gala, once vibrant with laughter and camera flashes, now stood suspended, caught between scandal and disbelief. The band had stopped playing mid-note. The catering staff stood awkwardly along the wall, trays in hand, unsure whether to serve or retreat. It was as though the night itself had paused to watch the empire of Malcolm Warren crumble in real time. He was still holding the microphone, though his voice had left him. Sienna stood inches away, her expression no longer victorious but stranded. Her carefully crafted curls seemed to droop under the weight of the moment. Her red lipstick, once bold, now looked like war paint on a soldier who had lost the battle before it even began. I took a slow breath. For years I had watched Malcolm weave stories, navigate boardrooms, charm investors, and manipulate outcomes with nothing more than a smirk and a glass of bourbon. He had built his reputation on the idea that he was always 2 steps ahead. But tonight, he hadn't even seen the trap beneath his feet. "Lila," I said gently, turning to my daughter, "you don't have to stay here for this." But she shook her head. "No, Mum. I want to see this through." I wasn't the only one who had been betrayed. Across the room, Andrew Warren, Malcolm's younger brother, stepped forward with slow, deliberate steps. His face, tight with disgust, said everything before he spoke. "You used our parents' foundation funds for this?" he asked Malcolm coldly. "You took money meant for scholarships and poured it into flight upgrades and beachfront hotel reservations." Malcolm opened his mouth to protest, but the truth cut him off before he could speak. "I saw the foundation's expense report this morning," Andrew continued. "I wondered why the numbers didn't add up. But now it all makes sense." The whispers were rising again, not scandalous anymore but damning. People who once greeted Malcolm with warm handshakes now edged away. His name, once printed proudly on event banners and donation plaques, now hung in the air like a warning. Sienna tried to reclaim some ground. "This is all being twisted," she said, her voice shaking. We never meant for it to happen like this. Oh, I believe you, I replied smoothly. You meant for it to happen quietly. No backlash, no headlines. Just a seamless exit and a life built on stolen trust. She blinked rapidly, caught in a reality she had never planned for. That's the thing about people like Malcolm and Sienna. They only understand power when it's in their hands. But tonight the applause had faded. The spotlight had shifted. And the audience, once enchanted, now watched with critical eyes and crossed arms. Margaret Lynn stepped forward once more. We've scheduled the hearing for next Thursday, she told Malcolm, her tone professional but cool. It's in your best interest to come prepared. And your phone records are already under subpoena. Malcolm finally dropped the microphone. It clanged against the wooden floor, the feedback slicing through the silence. He looked at me, really looked, like a man who had misjudged the entire game. You've ruined me, he said hoarsely. No, Malcolm, I replied. You did that all on your own. I just turned on the lights so everyone could see it. Emily approached quietly and pulled Lila into a hug. My daughter leaned into it, but her eyes never left her father. She was memorizing this moment, committing it to memory like a lesson she never wanted to forget. The gala's host stepped forward awkwardly. Perhaps we should resume the evening's events, she suggested. But it was too late. The magic was gone. The decorations looked garish now. The champagne tasted flat. The hall felt like a shell of something once beautiful, now tainted. I turned to Margaret. Is everything else in place? She nodded. Every account, every asset. The foundation has been notified. And the board meeting on Monday will finalize his suspension. I gave a faint nod. Very good. As Malcolm stood alone in the center of a room full of people, I could almost feel the weight of every lie finally settling on his shoulders. He had stolen moments, secrets, and trust. But tonight I stole back the narrative. And I wasn't done yet. To be continued. The golden hour had passed, and the river outside the hall shimmered with reflections of a city unaware that inside Charleston's grandest venue, one of its most celebrated couples had publicly fractured beyond repair. Guests began to trickle out in uneasy silence, stifled conversations trailing behind them like shadows. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others lingered near the exits, whispering into phones, no doubt already drafting messages to their circles. The story of Malcolm Warren's collapse would race across Charleston before the night was over. But inside I stayed. I wasn't done. The cleanup crew stood awkwardly, not daring to clear the table near Malcolm. He was still there, hunched slightly, the envelope tucked under one arm like a final act of denial. Sienna hovered beside him, her shoulders rigid, her purse clenched tightly under her arm. But her eyes betrayed her. They flicked toward the door, toward escape, toward anything but the ruin she now shared. Margaret and I sat at a table by the balcony, the night air brushing across our faces as if offering a kind of cleansing. Lila was with Andrew and Emily in the lounge, sipping water with trembling fingers. Her award stood untouched beside her seat. Are you sure you're ready for the next part? Margaret asked me gently. I looked toward Malcolm again, then nodded. Yes, he still thinks this ends with him making a deal. But he hasn't seen what's coming. Because in his mind, this was still salvageable. He believed we could split assets, agree to silence, and quietly walk away with matching statements to the press. But Malcolm forgot who he married. He didn't marry a trophy wife. He married a woman who watched trends, tracked fluctuations, and read the fine print. And this time the fine print was going to bury him. I stood and approached him once more. He looked up slowly, red-eyed and ragged. We can fix this, he said weakly, trying to summon that persuasive tone I'd heard him use on dozens of clients. No court battles. Just equal division. I'll even walk away from the Zurich office. I looked at him long and hard. You don't understand, I said softly. You're under investigation, Malcolm. Not just by your company, but by the Charleston Philanthropy Commission. You funneled donor money through shell firms. That's a felony. His face turned to stone. You wouldn't. I already did. His breath hitched. Sienna blinked rapidly, her lips parting like she wanted to speak, but no words arrived. I gave them a copy of every document you filed under the Coastal Dreams Initiative, I continued, including the ones you signed with aliases. One of them lists Sienna as a silent partner. Her head jerked toward him. You dragged me into this, she hissed. You said everything was clean. He didn't answer. That was the thing about Malcolm. When his lies unraveled, he left everyone tangled in them. You should get a lawyer, I told her quietly. You may have plausible deniability, but he's already thrown too many people under the bus to survive this without someone flipping. Margaret joined me, handing Sienna a folded letter. This is from the commission, she said. They'll want a statement. I suggest you take the weekend to prepare one. Sienna didn't take the paper at first, but eventually her fingers reached out, pale and shaking. Malcolm's mouth twitched. You've planned every detail. I met his gaze. I had to, because you made every moment of my life a chessboard. I just finally stopped playing defense. He looked past me then to Lila, who had stood silently near the edge of the hall. She was watching, not angrily, not tearfully, just with the hollow gaze of someone who had been forced to grow up in one evening. You don't have to lose her too, he whispered. But I shook my head. She'll decide for herself, I replied. But don't expect forgiveness to come before the truth. I turned back toward Margaret. It's time, I said. And with that, we left Malcolm standing beneath the chandeliers he once paid for, in a suit that now fit like a costume, in a life that had been rewritten without his permission. The night they chose for their escape would become the night they couldn't erase. And the city would remember. To be continued. By morning, the story had already broken. I woke to dozens of notifications, messages, missed calls, and articles spreading faster than I could scroll. Malcolm's name trended locally, linked to words like embezzlement, affair, and non-profit scandal. The Charleston Tribune had released a midnight article with the headline, Charity Gala turns scandalous as executives' affair and financial crimes are exposed. I didn't flinch. I didn't panic. Because I had prepared for this too. The night before, after leaving the gala, I handed over the final flash drive to journalist Rachel Monroe, a seasoned investigative writer who had once exposed a mayor's secret development deals. I'd been feeding her anonymous breadcrumbs for weeks. She was the perfect person to take the truth public with precision, not sensation. As the world digested the scandal, I sat in Margaret Lynn's office overlooking East Bay Street. The room was bright with sunlight, but the mood was clinical. Legal folders were stacked in neat rows, and Margaret was already on her third cup of black coffee, reading through a printed draft of the emergency hearing statement. He's panicking, she said without looking up. His legal team just emailed a request to postpone proceedings. Apparently, Sienna's attorney is claiming she had no knowledge of the account transfers. She didn't, I said. Not the full extent. But that doesn't make her innocent. She signed documents with fake company names. She enjoyed the perks. She played her part. Margaret nodded. And now she's watching it all collapse. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. There was a strange peace in watching justice do its quiet work. No more secrets. No more pretending. Have you spoken to Lila? Margaret asked. Not since this morning, I said. She needed time. I think she's staying with Emily and Andrew. Margaret glanced up. She'll come around. He nodded. Hope so. Because beneath all the fury and collapse, Lila's heartbreak was the hardest part to watch. She wasn't just mourning the marriage. She was mourning the man she thought her father was. A knock came at the office door. It was Denise Carter, my friend and head of internal compliance at Malcolm's firm. She looked exhausted but satisfied. It's done, she said. The board has voted. Malcolm's contract is terminated. Immediate effect. He'll lose severance, stock options, and every deferred bonus. Margaret raised an eyebrow. They moved fast. Everyone saw what happened, Denise replied. And they don't want donors pulling out. She handed me a copy of the letter. It was cold and concise, just like the world of corporate betrayal demanded. I held it for a moment before setting it down. Where is he now? Asked. Holed up at his condo downtown, Denise replied. Security had to escort him out of the office this morning. Sienna wasn't with him. Apparently, she went back to her parents' house around midnight. Margaret gave a soft chuckle. So much for Zurich. I didn't laugh. It didn't feel like victory yet. Because I knew what was coming next. The court battle. The media scrutiny. The long, drawn-out legal dance of dividing a life built over decades. But unlike Malcolm, I had no illusions. I wasn't chasing freedom. I was chasing closure. Before Denise left, she handed me a smaller envelope. One more thing, she said. You'll want to read this in private. She gave me a knowing look and stepped out. I opened it slowly. Inside was a printed email chain. Between Malcolm and a man named Connor Rhodes. Connor had been our family accountant 5 years ago. We let him go after a disagreement on a property deal. But apparently, Malcolm had re-established contact behind my back. The emails detailed instructions on how to transfer property assets to a separate trust, one I had never authorized, one that bore Sienna's initials. He had tried to erase me from our shared estate. Even in his final days of deceit, he'd planned one last erasure. But the attempt had failed. And now, every dirty thread was unraveling faster than he could spin. I closed the envelope, sat still, and let the moment settle. Because while the world focused on headlines, I focused on what mattered next. The courtroom. The statement. Endgame. To be continued. The courtroom smelled faintly of wood polish and old air. The kind of scent that settles in places where truths are forced to stand naked. It wasn't the grand hall many imagine from films. Just a modest chamber tucked inside the Charleston County Courthouse, lit by wide windows and quiet judgment. But for Malcolm, it may as well have been a stage carved from stone. He sat at the defendant's table. His once crisp navy suit now wrinkled and sagging at the shoulders. He looked smaller than usual, like the fabric no longer recognized the man inside it. Beside him sat a lawyer he'd hired in haste, a gray-haired man who flipped through his folder with the weary detachment of someone used to representing clients who'd already lost. Across from them, I sat in tailored black. Not as a woman scorned, but as a woman done waiting. Margaret Lynn stood beside me, composed as ever, her notes in perfect order. On the bench ahead, Judge Amber Holloway presided with sharp eyes and a mind like a guillotine. She had no patience for games. The room was still as the hearing began. Margaret stood first, her voice clear and deliberate. Your Honor, this case concerns not only marital dissolution, but the premeditated concealment of financial assets, the redirection of charitable funds, and the attempted fraudulent transfer of jointly held property. She laid out the facts like a surgeon. Offshore accounts disguised as business expansions, forged trust documents involving Sienna Cole, and detailed timelines showing when Malcolm began building his exit strategy, coinciding perfectly with his affair. Malcolm's lawyer objected several times, but Judge Holloway waved them off. You'll have your turn, counselor, she said dryly. But if your client wants sympathy, he's in the wrong building. At one point, a video recording was played. It was a clip from the gala. Malcolm's champagne toast. His confession. Sienna's smug declaration about their flight to Zurich. The moment he believed he'd seized control, only to be publicly dismantled by the envelope I had dropped at his feet. The courtroom was silent as it played. Then came the witness testimony. Denise Carter from the compliance department. Rachel Monroe, the journalist who'd received the tip. Even the property developer who'd questioned the sudden wire transfer to Sienna's shell company. Each one delivered calm, damning statements. Sienna was not in court. Her attorney had submitted a letter confirming her cooperation with the Philanthropy Commission's investigation. Her name had been scrubbed from the Zurich relocation plan. The word among legal circles was that she had turned in every document Malcolm ever sent her. An elegant betrayal to mirror his own. Malcolm sat motionless as the pages turned. And then Judge Holloway leaned forward. "Mr. Warren," she said slowly, "is there anything you wish to say before I rule on this asset motion?" He stood, cleared his throat, and faced her. "I made mistakes," he began, "but I didn't mean to hurt anyone. My marriage—" "Stop," the judge said, raising a hand. "This is not a confessional. It's a courtroom. The question is not whether you meant to hurt someone. It's whether you acted with intent to deceive, and whether you abused your financial authority to do so. From where I'm sitting, the evidence says yes." He sat down again, his hands clenched on his knees. Judge Holloway signed the emergency order. Effective immediately, the majority of our marital assets, homes, investments, intellectual property, were frozen from Malcolm's reach. The Zurich account, the fabricated trust, and the foundation misappropriations were all under investigation. His personal business license would be reviewed. His passport flagged for international activity. Until these matters are resolved, the judge concluded, Mr. Warren is not permitted to access or manage any financial account previously held jointly or connected to charitable foundations he administered. Additionally, pending the Philanthropy Commission's findings, criminal charges may follow. And with that, the gavel struck. Didn't echo. Thudded. Final. Cold. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Cameras flashed. Microphones were extended toward me, but I kept walking. Margaret shielded me from most of it, her voice firm. "No comment today." But Lila was there. She stood beside Andrew and Emily, her face pale but determined. When I reached her, she didn't speak. She just hugged me. Long. Like she finally understood everything she hadn't before. "He doesn't deserve your name anymore," she whispered. I held her close, not with vengeance, but with release. Because the courtroom had given me something no confrontation ever could. Gave me silence. Malcolm wouldn't speak for me again. To be continued. 2 days after the court hearing, a letter arrived at my doorstep. It came not from a lawyer or a court clerk, but from Malcolm himself. The envelope was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged, as if he'd hesitated before sending it. I held it in my hand for a long time before finally opening it, not out of fear but curiosity. I had faced his lies in public and survived the storm. There was nothing he could write now that would undo what had already been set in motion. Inside were 5 pages. Neatly written. No anger. Just desperation wrapped in regret. He began by saying he never meant for things to end this way. That old line, worn and hollow. He wrote about the pressure, about wanting to escape the routines of marriage, about the temptation of Sienna's admiration. He tried to explain that the affair wasn't about love, but freedom. He spoke of watching me at the gala, calm and composed, and realizing too late what real strength looked like. He asked if we could talk, not about reconciliation but for closure, as he put it. He said he didn't recognize himself anymore. And for once, I believed him. But I didn't write back. Because the man who had taken so much from me didn't deserve an epilogue. He had already gotten the ending he wrote for himself. Instead, I took that letter and placed it in the same safe where I now kept the finalized court order and the documents that proved his betrayal. Not as a trophy but as a record. A reminder of how far I'd come. That weekend, I met Lila for brunch at a small cafe near the waterfront. She arrived with tired eyes but a brighter spirit. She wore no makeup, her hair in a bun, and her award medal peeking from her tote bag. I could see something in her had shifted, a deeper kind of resilience. "I read the article in the Post," she said after our food arrived. "They're saying he might face criminal charges if the foundation audit comes back dirty." "He might," I said quietly. Lila sipped her coffee, then looked at me, unsure. "Do you feel better now?" I thought for a long time before answering. "I feel unburdened," I said, because better wasn't the right word. This wasn't joy or revenge. It was clarity. A cold, hard truth that left no room for illusions. Malcolm had torn our family in half, but in doing so, he had revealed what was always broken beneath the surface. Lila reached into her bag and handed me a small notebook. "I want you to have this," she said. "It's the journal I kept during the last semester. Before the gala, I wrote a lot about you, about watching you and Dad, about sensing things were off but not knowing how to ask." I opened it to a page marked with a ribbon. In neat, youthful handwriting she had written, "Mom is the only person I've ever seen turn pain into armor." I closed the journal and blinked away tears. That night, I sat by the window of my bedroom, lights off, Charleston's skyline flickering in the distance. I thought about the life I was stepping into, not as Malcolm's wife, not as the shadow behind his success, but as Celeste Warren, a woman who had weathered betrayal and answered it not with rage, but with precision. The doorbell rang just past 8. It was Emily, holding a white envelope. "This came to our house," she said. "It's addressed to you. But it's from Zurich." I froze for a moment, then took the envelope with a steady hand. Inside was a letter from the property developer overseeing the coastal villa Malcolm had intended to purchase with Sienna. The transaction had failed, of course, once the funds were frozen. But the letter was more than a notice. It included a scanned copy of an email Malcolm had sent to the developer weeks earlier. In it he had lied again, claimed I had passed away 2 years ago, that he was a widower, that Sienna was his fiancée. The lie sliced deeper than the affair ever could. He hadn't just erased me financially. He had tried to erase me from existence. Emily gasped as I handed her the paper. "He told them you were dead." "Yes," I said quietly. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was a burial. But now, standing in the quiet of my home, I realized something else. You cannot bury a woman who has already risen. To be continued. By Monday morning, the Zurich lie had made national news. The Charleston Tribune released a follow-up article titled, "Disgraced Executive Declared Wife Dead to Purchase Luxury Property." Within hours, it was syndicated to regional and international outlets. For years, Malcolm had worked his way into business magazines, social circles, charity galas. Now, his name returned with venom, sandwiched between disgrace and deception. I watched the news unfold in my office. My own, not one I shared with him. I had moved my consulting firm into a small downtown suite with clean glass walls and a corner view of the port. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had tried to exile me with financial sleight of hand, and here I was, signing new clients, expanding my services, and reviewing Lila's non-profit budget for the following year. She had asked me to help. Of course I said yes. My phone buzzed. "Margaret, they want your comment," she said plainly. "National outlets, morning shows, business insiders. Everyone wants the woman who turned betrayal into strategy." "No comment," I replied without hesitation. Margaret chuckled. "I figured. But I had to ask. Because the headlines weren't the prize. The headlines were noise. What mattered was what came next." Later that day, a package arrived at my office. No return label. Just my name written carefully across the front. Inside was a velvet jewelry box. And a note. "For your silence, M." It was a bracelet. Platinum, expensive, designed with the kind of flash Malcolm once used to distract me from the truth. A guilt offering. A desperate token sent by a man who had run out of excuses but still clung to the hope that money could patch a soul. I closed the box and slid it across the desk toward the waste bin. But I paused. I picked up the note and carried it into the next room, where a shredder hummed quietly near the printer. The paper disappeared in seconds, chewed into ribbons like every false promise that had once kept me bound. That night I met Lila again. We walked the quiet cobblestone paths behind the historic market square, our heels clicking in rhythm beneath the soft glow of iron street lamps. She was quiet for a long while, until finally she asked, "Do you think he'll ever stop? Stop trying?" Yes. "No. But eventually, he'll be forced to stop mattering. Because this wasn't just about a failed marriage. It was about the slow, meticulous way women are erased. Financially, emotionally, historically. Malcolm hadn't just betrayed me. He tried to delete me. To overwrite my name with his version of our story. But what he didn't understand was that I kept receipts. Of everything. Lila slipped her hand through mine. "You've become someone else," she said. "No," I answered. "I've become someone I used to be, before I bent myself into what he needed." We turned a corner and paused at a cafe window where the television inside was replaying footage from the gala. My face was frozen mid-speech, the moment just before I revealed the truth. And though I hadn't spoken to the press, they had chosen their own headline. Celeste Warren, the woman who turned the tables, smiled. Not because of the attention, but because, for the first time in years, the world was finally using my name. Not as his wife. Not as someone's shadow. But as my own. And I intended to keep it that way. To be continued. 6 weeks later, the sun rose over Charleston like it always had. Soft, golden, and indifferent to human chaos. But my world no longer looked the same. It had been dismantled, exposed, and rebuilt brick by brick with my own 2 hands. Not with vengeance. Not with spite. But with absolute clarity. The court had finalized the divorce 2 days prior. The judge ruled in my favor on every count. The marital estate, once a fortress built from shared ambition and sacrifice, was now stripped of its illusions. I retained the home, the business investments, and the art collection I had quietly appraised behind Malcolm's back during our last year together. The court ordered a full investigation into the Coastal Dreams Foundation. Malcolm's assets remained frozen, his passport revoked. And with Sienna's full cooperation, the state prepared for what would likely become a criminal trial. But by then I had already moved on. I sat at my new desk in my new office, overlooking the harbor. The windows were wide open to the breeze. Lila sat across from me with a laptop, scrolling through logistics for her next fundraiser. We had become a team in ways we never imagined. 2 women bonded not by shared wounds, but by the resolve to grow stronger than the storm that had tried to break them. "Guess what?" she said, eyes lighting up. "The nonprofit just secured its first city grant. 25,000. Smiled. "See. Told you. People believe in what's real. You've earned that." She paused, then leaned in. "You could have burned him completely," she said softly. "Gone to every press outlet. Dragged his name through every court." I met her eyes. "I didn't need to. Truth works slower than fire. But it lasts longer." The door knocked lightly, and Emily stepped in with a small bouquet of gardenias. "From Andrew and me," she said. "To your first day in the rest of your life." She set the flowers on my desk and gave Lila a wink before stepping back out. The room fell into a quiet rhythm after that. Lila typing. The wind rustling paper. Seagulls crying faintly in the distance. But even in that calm, echoes from the past lingered. Memories of dinners turned cold by silence, of hotel receipts slipped between folders, of a man smiling as he lied. Still, none of it could touch me now. Because the future was no longer something I entered carrying someone else's name. That evening, I attended a smaller, quieter gala, this time as a guest of honor. The city had chosen to recognize my contributions to financial advocacy for women. I wore a navy dress, sleek and simple. No borrowed diamonds. No stage-managed applause. Just me walking into a room on my own terms. The applause that met me was genuine. Among the attendees, I noticed a few familiar faces from the gala where everything had unraveled. They smiled, but with a different kind of respect this time. The kind not born from social climbing, but from witnessing someone rise from ashes they hadn't lit themselves. After the speeches, I slipped out onto the balcony, champagne in hand, the city lights dancing on the water. And there he was, Malcolm, standing at a distance beyond the velvet ropes on the far sidewalk. Alone. He looked older, not just in face but in spirit. Like the world had finally made him wear the weight of every shortcut he ever took. He didn't try to approach. And I didn't wave. We didn't owe each other anything anymore. Lila appeared beside me, looking out toward the water. "Do you regret it?" she asked. I took a sip of champagne, then let the silence speak before I answered. "No," I said. "Because sometimes it takes losing everything you never needed to find everything you really do." And with that, I turned from the past. Not in anger, but in peace. Because the speech he tried to finish that night, I had rewritten every word. And this time the story belonged to me.